This week on Talk by Turner, I'm joined by Aida Zilelian. Aida is a first-generation American-Armenian writer and educator. She's the author of the book, The Legacy of Lost Things. She's the recipient of the 2014 Tololyan Literary Award. Aida has also been featured on NPR, the Huffington Post, Kirkus Reviews, and Poets and Writers. Her short story collection, These Hills Were Meant for You, was shortlisted for the 2018 Katherine Anne Porter Award. I'm your host, Jeffrey Colon, and you're listening to Talk by Turner. Talk by Turner dives deep into intellectual discovery while examining what's happening in our world right here, right now. Join us each week to hear from industry experts and published authors as they share their knowledge and insight on today's most important topics. Now, let's see who's on this week's episode. Aida, welcome to Talk by Turner.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so you've written about your own personal experiences growing up as a first-generation Armenian-American, and how your family had to navigate between two cultures growing up, something a lot of people have to do. Has your understanding of how you fit within American and Armenian cultures changed as you've gotten older? And if so, in what ways?
So I was really immersed, very much it has changed. I was immersed in Armenian culture growing up. Both my parents were immigrants. My mother is Lebanese Armenian. My father is Romanian Armenian. After the genocide, this is where their family settled. Although my mother's side, I don't think was too affected by the genocide, and my father's side was completely wiped out. And so I was raised really immersed in Armenian culture. I went to school 5 days a week. I went to Saturday school and I went to Sunday school. And so for me, I don't even think I was encouraged to have American friends. And so it was very black and white, and it was very extreme. And now, many years later, I've really come to realize that it is up to me, right, to figure out what parts of my culture to embrace, what parts of American culture I embrace, and that really there's a lot more gray area than people realize until they get old enough and they kind of break away from their parents and figure themselves out, which is what I was able to do.
So it took basically, I guess, adulting or becoming an adult to sort of figure out what resonated with you and what didn't?
Yes, and completely breaking away from the culture. I really did. I played guitar and I sang for quite a while before I decided to really seriously dedicate myself to writing. I always wrote, but I played solo guitar and I wrote songs, and that's when I really departed from Armenian culture. And I think it's when my first book was published and I was interacting more with Armenian communities and organizations because they were featuring the book, that I slowly moved back in. And it's interesting because a lot of my friends who are Armenian now are writers. And that's the way I was able to return to my culture.
Is there a certain style of music that you gravitated toward? I have to ask.
Well, what I played and what I listened to may not have necessarily been the same thing, because I really was into The Cure and Susie and the Banshees and the Smiths and also Metallica. But my music, I don't know if you know who Elliott Smith is.
Yeah, huge fan.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with Elliott Smith. I was into PJ Harvey. So I would never say that I'm anything near them. But if we're talking about genre, then I'm kind of a cross between PJ Harvey and Elliott Smith as far as how I approach my songwriting.
Yeah, that's not a bad intersection to be in when you think of true artists.
Yeah, they were
I like
wonderful.
that.
Yeah.
So a question on immigration policy. It's frontline news day to day here in the United States. it's had a complicated history over the, last 6 decades. Of course, without immigration, we wouldn't really be the country that we are. So I'm curious, as a first generation American, how do you view the US and its relationship to immigrant communities?
Well, it's definitely about to change even more than it has, right? And it's interesting. Who were the presidents? It was who was running against Bush. I remember seeing a clip from the 80s, and the two candidates were talking about Mexico, okay? And what they were arguing about was, I'm going to be able to do this for the Mexicans who come here. No, but and they were actually debating on who is going to do more for these immigrants. And
Yeah, I
so,
think the interview you're referring to, not to cut you off, was George Herbert Walker Bush debating Ronald Reagan before they both teamed up and ran on the same ticket. I just watched that video. Yeah.
oh, so, right. And so here we are, and we don't have to get too political. I'm also a high school teacher,
Mm.
right? And so when he came into office the first time, we had students in our building removed and sent back. And I remember there were 3 girls specifically. I think they were Ecuadorian, and they were brilliant girls. And so I see this and they were getting so much out of living here, but they weren't legal. They were sent back. And to say it's upsetting as an educator, as a first generation, because honestly, all of us came from the immigrant experience, but it's so easy for Americans to forget that when they're 5th generation or 4th generation. And although I live in New York, I do find that the stereotypes and the stigmas, and I don't want to say false beliefs, but there's so much gray in there. The attitude towards immigrants is depending on who you're talking to, is much more negative than you would realize. We're not living in this safe bubble even in New York, right? So that's how I want to respond to that question without getting too political.
Yeah. So you're, as a first generation Armenian American, what are some other things that you take from that background and sort of apply to how you view the world right now in the 21st century?
Oh boy. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah. How do you take the background, your background as an Armenian American, that sort of all the experiences you've gone through, and how do you apply that to sort of the world that you navigate now in the 21st century?
That's really hard. That's a really hard question because it's very present in my writing, and it's very present in how I teach, because I teach in a very diverse school in Queens. I've been a high school teacher for 22 years. In teaching literature, so as an educator, I'm always striving to teach diverse literature, overlooked and marginalized cultures. I feel like in the literary world, those cultures are celebrated, and I'm so happy for that, because a lot of what I write about, I think that my writing would be completely different if I wasn't first generation. And it doesn't just apply to Armenians, but just anybody from a first generation culture. So I try to be more sensitive to my students, if that's even possible. That's one way. And it pushes me to be even more open-minded and understanding of cultures that I may not even be informed about the way that I should. Yeah.
It leads me to my next question, because you hinted on language, and language is it's incredibly important. And recently, there's been an executive order that's been signed that's made English the official language of the United States. So I'm curious on what your reaction is to this in terms of having an official language where we really didn't have an official language prior.
I mean, I understand the concept of an official language. I mean, on paper, it doesn't sound terrible to have an official language if you think about other countries that have an official language. But I think that because of where it's coming from, it negates other cultures, other languages. I don't know if I don't think I would feel so negatively about it if it was a different administration.
Yeah.
I mean, and that begs the question of, does every country need an official language? I guess because it's part of our identity and we do speak, but I'd love to know the percentage of Spanish speaking people, but we are really a melting pot. I mean, I'm conflicted about it because on paper it makes sense, but the theory from which it comes from feels very exclusive and prejudiced.
Thinking of exclusivity, how have you approached stereotypes? How have you navigated that terrain in terms of being a first generation American? How have you sort of seen things where you're like, wow, I want to sort of call that out, or I want to navigate that in a way that empowers others? How have you used that to navigate sort of the obstacles?
I mean, again, I'm going to talk about Armenians are such a small culture that there aren't really. Someone teased me, all you guys do is sit around and eat kebab. It's like, yeah, we eat kebab, but like stereotypes, it's not necessarily that they're inherently wrong, but the fact that no one can see beyond that. Yes, Armenians do eat a lot of kebab. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot more than just kebab. And, also you have the diaspora Armenians here. And
That's
then
right.
you have the Armenians from Armenia, and they have their own stereotype. And what I could say is that stereotypes may come from a real place, but when you use it as the defining way of making assumptions when you meet people, and again, thank God I teach in New York because it helps me from making immediate assumptions. I think I'm guilty of it without meaning to be. And I make a point of not being that way with my students, of assuming anything about them. Because, again, being first generation, my parents had no high school, they had no education. Okay, so that's a part of it. And when I first started teaching, I taught in Long Island City. I taught next to the two biggest housing projects in Queens. So you have Ravenswood and Queensbridge. And I worked in a building with 5,000 students, 6 floors, and 3 security guards. And so after coming out of that and starting as a special ed teacher, they kind of just threw me in out of license. And then I by the time I left that school, I was teaching AP literature, and you see these kids showing up, Croatian and Yugoslav, and their parents don't even speak English, and these kids are reading Machiavelli. It just destroys any stereotype you can have about a first generation, black, brown. I mean, and the things that people would say to me were so insulting to these minorities. And I would say to them, like, you've no idea what you're talking about. No idea, because just doesn't matter where you come from. It's what you do with what you come from, I think.
Thinking of inclusivity, which is a nicer topic, and how social media plays into that, how it's pretty much easier than ever to connect with people across the world. Would you say that internet culture and social media are positive forces, or are they negative forces in terms of encouraging cross-cultural communication and understanding?
You know what? That's so subjective because, right, that's really hard to say because everybody is looking at something. It's like affirmation bias, right? The things that I'm looking at are going to say that it supports inclusivity, even as something as simple as, when I'm submitting a piece of work It'll say like, if you are underrepresented and marginalized, under, this is up, we're gonna waive the fee, for example, right? And so you submit enough times to these literary journals and you feel that. So it really depends on where you're looking on social media, because that really dictates what happens in your feed. So I would say, yeah, absolutely, sure, absolutely. But somebody who doesn't have my political leanings, they may be looking at something else that does not support what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book, All the Ways We Lied. Um, what's a good takeaway that could help people be more empathetic to folks from different backgrounds and different countries that you wrote about in the book?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, I think growing up, I've said this before. I don't know where I got the idea growing up that like mental illness was more of an American thing, not because I looked down on Americans, but because it was just never mentioned in the Armenian community. Narcissism, personality disorders, depression, like that stuff was really taboo. You never talked about that kind of stuff. And I think that's very traditional of collectivistic cultures, right? A lot of my students' parents do not support therapy, for example. So the biggest takeaway, if you're going to really like put it in layman's terms, is that uh, no culture is immune to mental illnesses. No culture is immune to dysfunctional family dynamics, and those are the two things that that novel really speaks to.
Hmm. Do you think that, or, what's your advice for anyone who is struggling with navigating between two cultural identities right now, especially in this current environment that we're in?
I would say to ignore the way you were raised if you can at all, and ignore what's going on in the world and figure out what your virtues are and what's important to you and what defines you as a person, right? Like, what does it mean to be Armenian? That's for me to choose. Is it that I speak the language, which I do? Is it that I want my daughter to understand it at least and speak? Yes. Does it mean that I cook the food? Yeah, right. So you just have to figure out. It's very hard when you're raised a traditional way of figuring out what I wanted or is it what my family and my parents wanted. And I know adults who still have not figured that out and they've moved on and taken the traditional path. And I wonder for them if this was something they did consciously or if it was just something without question that they just made these decisions. So it's about really figuring out, who am I, what's important to me, and what does it mean to be American, what does it mean to be from this culture, and embracing that without fear.
That was going to lead to my next question, which is, was there a particular moment in your childhood that had to directly confront your identity as an Armenian American, like that sticks out to you that you can like recollect?
You know what? It was not a moment, but it was in my adolescence. That's really when I started breaking away.
Mm.
Because my parents had a very dysfunctional marriage and my friends came from families, and you could tell it was very typical. It wasn't like dysfunctional, it was just very typical, like stereotypical. And I grew up really understanding that behind closed doors there was something very, very wrong. And that the kids I grew up with, and I think that that's when I realized that, or I thought that there's no way I could be part of this Armenian culture that I know, because my family is too dysfunctional for me to have a sense of belonging in my culture. My family is not like other Armenian families. I don't belong in this. This was this was really how I thought. And once I started playing
Mm.
guitar and music, forget about it. Because at
Yeah.
that point, I was in my early 20s. A lot of the women my age had graduated college. They moved on to a serious relationship. They were getting their masters. They were choosing these really solid career paths, and they were getting married and I wasn't having any of that at all. Like none of it.
Interesting.
Can we pause?
What's one thing that you'd love for listeners to take away from the conversation today?
That's a great question. What they could take away from this conversation. Well, especially because of today's climate, you need to lean in and write about or express yourself in any way you want about feelings of being marginalized, underrepresented, canceled, silenced, and that now more than ever, it is really important. And even if it's the uglier parts of our culture, it doesn't matter as long as you are creating something that's giving voice to your identity. Identity is more important now than ever. And to not shy away from expressing those parts of yourself.
Aida Zilelian, she's author of the book, All the Ways We Lied. Where can we find you online?
My website's aidazilelian.com. And I do have a chapbook collection coming out in June. I just won a contest for that. I'd return to poetry in February. So that will be posted on the website. You can find my book on the Turner website, as well as Amazon and Barnes & Noble and local Queens bookstores. It's available everywhere.
Aida, thanks for joining us on Talk by Turner.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Talk by Turner, hosted by Jeffrey Colon. Watch and listen now wherever you enjoy podcasts.